Hello and most welcome to 804 of the Heidegger series. We will today start a new article by Francis Lin of Beijing. Wittgenstein on thinking as a process or an activity. Abstract. In this paper, I focus on a major aspect of the later Wittgenstein's investigation of thinking. His discussion of the idea of thinking as a process or an activity. I shall show that Wittgenstein's remarks, apart from some concerning the methodology and conception of philosophy, are grammatical remarks, meaning that they describe the use of the word thinking and can be agreed to by every competent speaker. I thus show that Wittgenstein's investigation of thinking is a grammatical one, and hence that there is no inconsistency between his conception of philosophy and his philosophical practice. In the process of doing so, I shall also review previous studies on this topic and point out their deficiencies.
Ja, i så fall skulle jag tänker mest på när man ser på TV och sånt där också kanske. Och det kanske inte går med dem, hur det är med resten, så utan då resten. Ja.
Introduction. Thinking is a most important concept for the later Wittgenstein's philosophical investigation. The Blue Book can be seen to be devoted wholly to its investigation. On the first page of that book, Wittgenstein tells us that we are up against one of the great sources of philosophical bewilderment, as substantive makes us look for a thing that corresponds to it. And 2 pages later, he makes clear that we are tempted to regard thinking as a mental process which gives life to science, which otherwise would seem to be dead. Wittgenstein then discusses various aspects of thinking to try to remove such a temptation until the end of the book. In the philosophical investigations, Wittgenstein starts to discuss thinking extensively from paragraph 316. He even ends part 1 of the book with a remark on thinking in paragraph 693. There are also many remarks on thinking in Wittgenstein's other writings. For instance, philosophical grammar, Settle, remarks on the philosophy of psychology. All this shows that if we are to understand Wittgenstein's later philosophy, we must have an adequate understanding of his investigation of thinking. Yet the literature on Wittgenstein's thoughts on thinking is quite impoverished. Accompanied with that on other topics such as meaning, rule following, and private language in Wittgenstein's studies. In this paper, I focus on a major aspect of Wittgenstein's investigation of thinking. His discussion of the idea of thinking as a process or an activity. I shall show that Wittgenstein's remarks, apart from some concerning the methodology and conception of philosophy, are grammatical remarks, meaning that they describe the use of the word thinking and can be agreed to by every competent speaker, in doing so, I shall review previous studies on this topic and point out their deficiencies. A great challenge in understanding the later Wittgenstein's philosophy is that there seems to be an inconsistency between his conception of philosophy and his actual philosophical practice. On the one hand, Wittgenstein explicitly announces that his remarks are reminders of what we have always known, that they contain nothing hypothetical, and that everybody would agree to them. On the other hand, most of his remarks in philosophical investigations appear to be nothing of these sorts. I hope that the present paper shows that the sad inconsistency does not really exist, at least on the issue where the thinking is a process or an activity. Two, thinking as a process. As I said in the introduction, as substantive make us look for a thing that corresponds to it. This is Augustine's picture of meaning. Wittgenstein speaks of at the beginning of philosophical investigations. We naturally wonder what thinking is, and we are tempted to conjecture that thinking corresponds to a process. When we then try to find out what this process is and may come up with various answers, such as that thinking is having a series of mental images, is talking, is conducting in a speech, or is a process accompanying other processes, for instance, speaking. Wittgenstein, of course, rejects all these answers, and scholars have tried to explain these rejections, but those explanations are not satisfactory, as I shall make clear in this section. I shall also provide a more adequate explication of Wittgenstein's thoughts. Two one. Thinking is not having a series of images. It is tempting to view thinking as having a series of images. For example, Aristotle asserts that thought does not occur without imagery. Commentators generally think that for Wittgenstein, having images is neither sufficient nor necessary for thinking. Take the issue of necessity first. Heidegger effectively says that when one thinks, one needs not have images occurring in the mind. Johnston states that when we think we do not always experience images. That is, or for instance, when reading, we may only experience images occasionally and may not experience them at all. What are Wittgenstein's own words on this issue? In PG, Wittgenstein remarks on the relationship between understanding and having images. I hear a word and someone asks me, "Did you understand it?" And I reply, "Truly, yes." What happened when I understood? how was the understanding different from what happens when I do not understand a word? Suppose the word was tree. If I am to say truly that I understood it, must the image of a tree have come before my mind? No, nor must any other image. Here Wittgenstein explicitly says, with the help of the example of the word tree, that having images is not necessary for understanding. And I think that all of us can agree with him. I also think Wittgenstein would also say that having images is not essential for thinking either. Just as Johnston points out, when we read a sentence, say one containing the word true, with thought, we may not have the image of a tree coming up before the mind. Now, let us turn to the issue of sufficiency. Heidegger states that mental imagery is not sufficient for thinking. His explanation is that reciting the multiplication table or the alphabet in one's mind is not thinking. There's a problem with Heidegger's explanation. (193) discussed in section 3 below does not say that reciting the multiplication table or the alphabet in one's mind is not thinking. In that remark, Wittgenstein talks of the problems of identifying activities. For instance, speaking in one's imagination with thinking. But he does not say that having images is insufficient for thinking. So Hacker has not really explained why having images is insufficient for thinking. Johnston provides a reason for why having images is insufficient for thinking. Another problem is that not all thoughts can easily be presented in pictures. This is true not only of abstract ideas, but also of everyday thoughts. For example, it is unclear what images correspond to the thought. It is a pity I didn't stay at the morning meeting longer, because although it was boring, I might have got the opportunity of having a quiet word with N. And by that end, I put an end to 804. Say thank you very much for listening in. And have a very pleasant morning, day, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are. Bye-bye.